Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor was a shock to the Americans, but it was preceded by serious intelligence failures. More than 2,400 American service members and civilians were killed, and dozens of planes and ships destroyed or damaged in the December 7, 1941, Japanese attack on the American naval base at Pearl Harbor. The attack, which decisively drew the United States into World War II, remains one of the worst intelligence failures in U.S. history. That failure was the result of several factors, including gaps in American officials' knowledge about Japanese intentions and their inability to accurately assess signs of an impending attack based on information available to them at the time. Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor was, in the words of historian Roberta Wallstetter, an attack presaged by a mass and variety of signals, which nonetheless achieved complete and overwhelming surprise. 1. In the summer of 1940, American military analysts cracked a type of Japanese diplomatic code codenamed Purple, giving American officials valuable insights into Japanese foreign policy. By late 1941, American military analysts have been intercepting and decrypting Japanese diplomatic messages for years as part of a program codenamed Magic, a success so closely guarded that the American public did not find out about it until after the war. But decrypting and translating those messages was a time-consuming process, and breaking Japan's diplomatic code was not the same thing as breaking all relevant Japanese codes. Unfortunately for American codebreakers, Japan's Army and Navy used codes that differed not only from those used by the Foreign Ministry, but were different from each other as well. In both Washington and Hawaii, American analysts worked feverishly to break Japanese military codes, but by December 1941 there were still significant gaps in their knowledge. Further complicating the Americans' efforts to read Japanese military communications was the fact that the Imperial Japanese Navy changed its codes several times in the months leading up to the attack on Pearl Harbor. Despite their struggles to break Japanese codes, American analysts were closely tracking Japanese naval activity. In late November 1941, after Japan's leaders made the decision to attack the United States, the task force sailing for Pearl Harbor did so under great secrecy. Operating under strict radio silence, the Japanese fleet successfully concealed its position from the Americans. Aircraft are prepared for launch on the Imperial Japanese Navy aircraft carrier Akagi to participate in the second wave of attacks on Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. December 7, 1941. Wikimedia Commons. Writing in 2010, political scientist Robert Jervis observed that intelligence is a game between hiders and finders, and the former usually have the easier job. This was especially true in the run-up to the attack at Pearl Harbor. At this critical moment, with the attack only days away, U.S. Navy intelligence analysts at Pearl Harbor under Commander Joseph Rockefeller reported to Admiral Husband E. Kimmel, commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, that they did not know the exact whereabouts of 4 Japanese aircraft carriers. 3. American military officials on the ground also missed the signs of an impending Japanese attack on the morning of December 7, 1941. But besides their failures to collect vital intelligence on Japanese intentions and to accurately interpret information they did have, the Americans made an even greater blunder in failing to imagine that a devastating surprise attack on a heavily defended American naval base was a realistic possibility. In early 1941, for instance, the American ambassador in Japan, Joseph Grew, sent a brief but disturbing message to his superiors in the State Department. Grew reported that the Peruvian minister to Japan had told American diplomats that the Japanese military forces planned, in the event of trouble with the United States, to attempt a surprise mass attack on Pearl Harbor using all of their military facilities. But without adequate intelligence assets in Japan to investigate the report, And without an independent intelligence agency to collect and interpret intelligence reports from civilian and military sources, the warning went unheeded. A Navy photographer snapped this photograph of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in Hawaii on December 7, 1941, just as the USS Shaw exploded. The stern of the USS Nevada can be seen in the foreground. National Archives, 80 G 16871. In the summer of 1946, after months of hearings and testimony, Congress released a massive report on the attack on Pearl Harbor, ending with 22 conclusions and recommendations that aimed to prevent such an attack from happening again. While many of them dealt with the very practical needs to coordinate intelligence activities and share information, the 10th conclusion had larger implications. Had greater imagination and a keener awareness of the significance of intelligence existed, the report's authors wrote, is proper to suggest that someone should have concluded that Pearl Harbor was a likely point of Japanese attack. 6. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Americans redoubled their efforts to break Japanese naval codes. Led by Joseph Rockefeller, who felt personally responsible for failing to detect the Japanese attack, Navy codebreakers in Hawaii worked night and day to identify Japan's next moves. 7 After months of work, they were able to break a key Japanese naval code known as JN-25. Armed with the ability to now read some naval communications, Rockefeller and his team concluded that the Japanese were planning a major attack on the American base at Midway Island. This intelligence breakthrough was instrumental in the American victory at the Battle of Midway, in which U.S. planes sank 4 Japanese aircraft carriers and halted Japan's Pacific offensive. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, shocked the United States, leading to its immediate entry into World War II. The death toll was staggering. More than 2,400 Americans were killed, and the surprise assault left numerous ships and aircraft destroyed or damaged. Despite years of intelligence work, including code-breaking efforts that yielded valuable information about Japanese diplomatic moves, the attack on Pearl Harbor remains one of the most significant intelligence failures in U.S. history. The attack was not completely without warning. It was preceded by a series of signals, some vague, others more specific, that if properly interpreted, could have foreshadowed the assault. As historian Roberta Wallstetter described it, Pearl Harbor was an attack presaged by a mass and variety of signals, which nonetheless achieved complete and overwhelming surprise. The events surrounding the attack offer critical lessons in the limitations of intelligence gathering, the complexities of code breaking, and the failure of imagination in interpreting the available evidence. The U.S. intelligence community had been monitoring Japanese activity for years before the attack. During the summer of 1940, American cryptanalysts succeeded in cracking a critical Japanese diplomatic code known as Purple. This breakthrough gave American officials valuable insights into Japan's foreign policy, particularly its growing hostility toward the United States. By late 1941, this code-breaking success was formalized under the Operation Codename Magic, which allowed the U.S. to decrypt and analyze Japanese diplomatic communications. However, while the Magic program was a significant success, it was limited to deciphering the diplomatic codes used by Japan's foreign ministry. One of the critical limitations in American intelligence efforts was the inability to crack Japan's military codes. Japan's Army and Navy used different codes for military communications, which were far more complex and tightly guarded than their diplomatic counterparts. Despite the work of American cryptanalysts at both the National Security Agency, NSA, and the Navy, there were still significant gaps in knowledge when it came to military communications. Japan's military changed its codes frequently, further complicating the efforts to track their intentions. This problem was exacerbated by the sheer volume of communications and the painstakingly slow process of decrypting them. A report from Navy intelligence officer Joseph Rockefort, stationed at Pearl Harbor, noted that as of December 1941, the U.S. Navy did not know the whereabouts of key Japanese warships, including 4 aircraft carriers vital to the forthcoming attack. Despite efforts to decipher Japanese naval codes, it would not be until months after the attack that American cryptanalysts broke Japan's JN-25 naval code, a critical intelligence victory that would later play a pivotal role in the Battle of Midway. Despite ongoing intelligence work, U.S. officials failed to anticipate the location and timing of Japan's assault. One of the most significant failures in the lead-up to the attack was not a lack of information, but a lack of imagination and preparedness. On the morning of December 7, 1941, American commanders were caught completely off guard by the surprise assault, despite several signs that an attack might be imminent. One such warning came from U.S. Ambassador to Japan Joseph Grew. In early 1941, Grew sent a brief but alarming message to Washington reporting that the Peruvian minister to Japan had indicated that Japan's military forces were planning a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor in the event of a conflict with the United States. Unfortunately, this message went largely ignored, due in part to a lack of independent intelligence operations in Japan. Without reliable human intelligence sources, and with few assets on the ground in Japan, American officials had difficulty verifying this kind of report. Furthermore, at the time, there was no unified intelligence agency to process and assess information from military and diplomatic sources in a coordinated fashion. This oversight was compounded by a larger failure in imagination. The possibility of an aerial assault on a heavily fortified naval base like Pearl Harbor seemed almost unthinkable. American military doctrine and strategy focused primarily on the threat of a naval confrontation in the Pacific, not an aerial surprise attack on an island base. As a result, even when there were warnings that Japan might strike at Pearl Harbor, few believed it was a plausible scenario. The American failure to anticipate the attack was not just a matter of missing intelligence. It was a systemic failure to think creatively about the enemy's capabilities and intentions. The result was a catastrophic lack of preparation. When Japanese planes descended on Pearl Harbor on the morning of December 7th, the base was largely unprepared for a sustained assault. The U.S. fleet was anchored in a predictable pattern. Aircraft were parked in rows on the tarmac, and there were insufficient air patrols or defensive measures in place to detect or prevent the attack. The U.S. Navy played a key role in monitoring Japanese activities in the months leading up to the attack. Commander Joseph Rockefort and his team of cryptanalysts at Pearl Harbor were tasked with intercepting and decoding Japanese military communications. Unfortunately, despite months of effort, the Navy was unable to uncover the specific details of Japan's plans, particularly the location of its attack force. Rockefort's team, however, had managed to identify certain patterns in Japan's movements that should have raised suspicions. For example, they knew that Japan's diplomatic stance had become increasingly belligerent and that the country had cut off oil supplies to the United States in the months prior to the attack. Nevertheless, the U.S. Navy was unable to correlate these factors with the likelihood of a military strike on Pearl Harbor. The focus of intelligence gathering was more on Japan's broader strategic intentions rather than on the precise timing and location of its attack. In the critical weeks leading up to the attack, there were significant intelligence signals that suggested Japan was preparing for war. American radio intercepts picked up communications indicating that Japan had mobilized its fleet, but the transmissions were vague and difficult to interpret. The Japanese fleet operated under strict radio silence, making it nearly impossible to detect their movements. In the final days before the attack, U.S. Navy intelligence analysts at Pearl Harbor reported that they were still unable to locate 4 Japanese aircraft carriers that were believed to be part of the strike force. Despite these reports, U.S. commanders in Hawaii failed to raise the necessary alarms, leaving Pearl Harbor vulnerable to the attack. In the aftermath of the Pearl Harbor attack, a congressional investigation was launched to determine what went wrong and how such a devastating surprise could have occurred. The resulting report, released in 1946, outlined 22 conclusions and recommendations aimed at preventing future intelligence failures. Among the most significant findings was that there was a lack of imagination and foresight among American officials. The authors of the report argued that had there been a greater awareness of the possible threat to Pearl Harbor, the attack might have been prevented or at least mitigated. The report also recommended changes in how U.S. intelligence agencies coordinated and shared information. One key recommendation was the establishment of a more centralized intelligence structure that would ensure better coordination between military and civilian intelligence agencies. The report's authors emphasized that intelligence was not only about gathering data, but also about interpreting it correctly, which in turn required imagination and an understanding of the enemy's capabilities. After the attack, the United States redoubled its efforts to break Japan's military codes. Under the leadership of Joseph Rockefeller, American cryptanalysts worked tirelessly to decode the JN 25 Naval Code, which was the key to understanding Japan's military plans. This success proved instrumental in the Battle of Midway in 1942, where American forces, armed with intelligence about Japanese movements, managed to sink 4 Japanese aircraft carriers and shift the balance of power in the Pacific theater. The attack on Pearl Harbor was a wake-up call for the United States and its intelligence agencies. It revealed both the limits of code-breaking and the importance of strategic imagination in intelligence work. Although American cryptanalysts had made significant progress in decrypting Japan's diplomatic codes, their failure to break Japan's military codes and their inability to connect the dots between various intelligence signals ultimately allowed the attack to succeed. The lessons of Pearl Harbor about the importance of imaginative thinking, the need for better coordination between intelligence agencies, and the crucial role of both human intelligence and technical intelligence have had lasting impacts on the U.S. intelligence community. In the years following the attack, the United States would overhaul its intelligence gathering operations and become more adept at analyzing and interpreting complex data. However, the tragedy of Pearl Harbor remains a reminder of how even the best intelligence systems can fail when key elements, such as imagination and foresight, are missing.